Greetings, fellow alchemists, and welcome to Wordplay Wizardry. In the last video, we got into the geopolitical and socioeconomic aspects of world building, which means at this point, you've got land, climate, government, technological levels, and civilizations. So what's next? Well, think about our own world. What's missing are the finer details: building materials, transit, lighting, specific technology, clothing, and motifs. When Peter Jackson was working on the first 3 Lord of the Rings movies, he took this stance, quote, "I want to think that Lord of the Rings was real, that this was history. We are the luckiest film crew because we get to go into the real locations and shoot this film." Slightly paraphrased, but that was his sentiment to the design team. This is the sentiment that you need to adopt when world building. So let's begin with the last one that I mentioned, motif. Motif refers to a repeating pattern, element, or style. When you look at various cultures around the world, they all have different and unique styles. If I were to mention a time frame or era, there's a good chance that you'd have an image pop into your head. And because we have multiple styles, it wouldn't be uncommon to have multiple styles if you have multiple cultures in your story. In fact, you might say it's vital to have those multiple styles. Each culture or society or even grand civilization would have something unique, would build something special, design special. Not only is this common motif important for structures, but everyday items as well: clothing, jewelry, armor, and other personal things. And this is where we find that symbols or symbolism feeds into that distinction. Symbolism can mean a lot of different things, but in this instance, it refers to an identifier of a particular group or religion. A city's coat of arms, for example, or a family's, or in terms of religion, the cross for Christianity or the Star of David for Judaism. These are symbols, and sometimes you get a motif from these symbols. Beyond those couple, fantastic examples of symbolisms in play are the house sigils from Game of Thrones. Each house has a different color scheme and symbol to represent them. You see a wolf, you know it's the Starks; a lion, the Lannisters; a stag, the Baratheons. And these symbols are woven into more aspects than just banners. They're on clothes, on armor, on wagons. When you design a culture, its motif should be easily recognizable. And since you don't have the luxury of visuals, a good description will have to do. So make it a great one. Now, this leads into a couple other detail points, namely clothing and building material. So let's start with materials. In our world, building materials reveal several things. They harken back to a society's motif. They speak to the availability or regional options. They show the level of advancement, and they hint at the general wealth of the society. Of course, there's also the issue of necessity. What building materials are needed? Does someone living out in nature need steel and concrete to build a home? Probably not. In that case, natural materials make the most sense. Wood and clay and mud. Especially true if said person lives alone. They'd have to do all the work themselves. Another example of this is the homesteaders and pioneers in America. They made log cabins and sod buildings because those were the materials available to them. Now, for a town or a city or something bigger, other materials can come into play. Stone, masonry, wood, things of this nature. For science fiction, you can get those kind of things on planets, but off of them, you start to see more metals, more alloys, more blends. You could still see brick or concrete homes on Earth, but then you'd see steel alloys or other metal alloys off-world. The same holds true for other species and their home worlds. When they build, they do so with a certain style and with specific materials. If they have a unified society, everything will be done with the same motif. If it's a segmented society or has different factions, you're going to see a base style and then the factions make it their own. Of course, the making it their own could just be symbols they apply or a color palette choice. Another option could be buildings have the same base style with specific motif accents. That same society would also use building materials specific to their world. Perhaps iron isn't as common, so the structural alloys will be different. Let me give you an example to illustrate changes in motif. If I said castle, you'd probably get an image in your head, but said image would likely depend on where you live. All similar, but slightly different. This is motif. And yes, European Middle Ages castles look surprisingly similar, but there are differences. Maybe it's the type of stone used. Maybe it's the interior layouts. Of course, with later castles, you do get a much more heavy influence from a local motif. Clothing continues the regional aspect of motif. First and foremost is material availability, because you simply can't make clothing out of a material that doesn't exist in a region, unless you have large-scale trade. But at the same time, you can't really build buildings from material that's too far away. And oftentimes, at least in clothing, the material itself becomes part of the motif. There's other modifiers as well. What is common? What is rare? What is expensive? What is easy for the average person to make? Is the most common product linen or cloth? What type of cloth? Wool or cotton? Is leather common? Is it necessary? Is there a common style to garments? In our world, we see this all the time. A common Western style would be something like jeans and a t-shirt. In Islamic culture, the more common combination would be a throbe top and sarwal pants. In India and the surrounding areas, it would be a kurta or kameez top and shalwar pants. Of course, if I've mispronounced, mislabeled, or misappropriated any of these names, I do apologize. But hopefully you get the idea of region-specific clothing. And with each of those examples, they are usually made from traditional or locally available materials. Let me give you a literary example. In the third Star Runner book, the officers of the ship have to attend a ceremony and are required to wear formal attire, dress uniforms. Each member of the collective decided on its own style of formal attire. Human leaders chose a style that we often see today: dress slacks or a skirt, and a well-fitted jacket or coat. I'm sure if I said military dress uniform, you'd get an image in your head, and it would probably match what I've described in the book. Now another race, one from an ocean world, chose long, flowing robes as their formal attire, something that would evoke the waves of their planet. Another chose something befitting of their people, something that blended fabric and armor plating. Even in a formal setting, they show their survival mentality. Now, each of those examples has a style, and each is a representation of their people. Granted, when you say that people from the ocean world chose long, flowy robes and people from a desert world chose integrated armor plating, it sounds a little strange. But as I said, those from the desert world value survival, and armor is the physical representation of that. Another big thing to consider is transit. And there's a reason I didn't just say transportation. Transportation is just the conveyance. Transit is the whole system. Now, in America, we have the Department of Transportation, which is responsible for transportation projects, roads and bridges, and creating regulations for safety. However, for literary purposes, I want to define things a little differently. A transport is a vehicle. The transit system is a combination of all of the elements: the transport vehicle, the road, and the path. So in a fantasy world, the transit system would be this combination: a horse or carriage moving between villages on a dirt road. In science fiction, it might be a cargo ship traveling FTL lanes between colonies. Designing a transit system means designating the different modes of transport and the various pathways they take on their journey. The only guideline here is that the methods chosen must fit within the world. And transportation leads us to another aspect: technological advancement. What has civilization achieved when your story opens? Before defining the technological level, you'll need to determine the time period of your story. Is it modern? Is it in the future? Or is it in the past? With past and modern, we already know the level of technology, which then only requires the specific addition that your story is going to make. With future, this is where you get to invent. With that in mind, let's turn to science fiction for some examples. Can ships go faster than light? Or utilize FTL? What type of weapons do people use? Is there artificial gravity? But here's the kicker. Not only do you have to choose the technological levels, you also have to define them. With science fiction, you do have to justify them. Namely, you've got to have some grounded explanation for how that technology works. And no, we don't have FTL travel now. But that doesn't mean that you can't extrapolate a possible method from current means. But the explanation cannot be, it just works. Even if you never explain within the story, you still need to know, or at least have an idea of how it works. Is it a generator that releases particles to hyper-accelerate a ship's standard engines? Is it a device that creates a dimensional shift to another plane where the laws of physics no longer apply? For artificial gravity, is it a system that generates high-density matter and energy, thereby creating artificial mass? Is it a low-level electromagnetic field that attracts metallic microfilaments woven into everything? Is any of that possible? No idea. But it could be. We just haven't discovered the scientific principles that make it possible yet. Now, as for fantasy, the technological level gets a little easier. Why? All you're doing is picking a century. Which century? from our own history matches closest with your story? Is it 100 CE, 1000 CE, 1400 CE, 1700 CE, 2000 BCE, 1800 CE, 100 BCE? You know, I really could just keep naming centuries, but I won't. If you're talking traditional fantasy, the common time period to use is the European Middle Ages, between 500 CE and 1500 CE. The advantage with fantasy is once you've picked an analogous time, all you have to do is do a little research and look back and find out what was available during that time period. And then you can just integrate it into your story. In this way, fantasy becomes part historical fiction. The setting and nations might be fictional, but everything else has a real-world mirror. We started this discussion with motif, and we're going to circle around to one last element of it, and that is lighting. The topic of lighting is one that blends two aspects together: technology and motif. Historically, lighting came in the form of fire, but now you have to ask, was it oil lamps or candles, torches or pits? If it's a lamp, what's the style? Metal or glass? If it's candles, what's the method? Beeswax or tallow? Is there a design to the creation? With science fiction, there's a wider range of possibilities when it comes to lighting. There's a good chance that at some point in the future, society moves past the incandescent light bulb, which means you'll need another source. But once again, you have to ask, is it based on something we already have? Or is it entirely new? Is it something like LED or something we haven't discovered yet? It could be as simple as a noble gas, like neon. Perhaps then your world uses krypton lights or xenon lights. By now you may have noticed I haven't discussed all of the finer details, and that's because in part we already have. When looking at the socioeconomic landscape and the type of jobs your society will have, you also identify the products your society will have. Glass blowers, stone cutters, metalsmiths, woodcutters, sculptors, carvers, blacksmiths. All these jobs determine the type of products available to your characters. The same goes for money. Once you decide the type, it's likely you defined the shape and style as well. As for motif, perhaps it's a different shape per society. Perhaps it's a different engraving per society. But once you define the money, you can make each one a little bit different. And you'll usually do that once you have those societies in place, or once you have the money itself in place. And here's where the crossover happens. Yes, you've already said you've got a tailor, a cobbler, and a glassblower, but that doesn't mean you've got specific items. Shirt makers are the same the world over, but until they've got a specific style and material, they aren't making anything. The same goes for a glassblower. Without choosing an oil lamp as your lighting source, they can only make other products, things we know are made out of glass. And even then, some glassblowers will specialize in just oil lamps. It's the same for a lot of other jobs. Until you choose, they will do something generic or nothing at all. At this point, I would argue that your world should start to feel alive. It's got a look and a feel. It's got a history. There's jobs and people and a system of government. It's got culture and unique styles. if you've done your job, you should be able to read the description of your new world to someone, and they get a clear image of what you've created in their mind. What would it sound like and smell like and feel like to walk down a street? What would it mean to live in certain areas? If you've done your job, you've created a world, a living, breathing thing. Congratulations. Next up, wrecking it all. I'm just kidding. That's not next. That happens later. But enjoy this period because there's something new, all thanks to you. Of course, new being a relative term, as the inhabitants of your brand new world have been living there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And with that, I'll bring this episode to a close. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, if there's something you'd like to see me expand on, leave a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're enjoying what you watch, leave a comment. Until next time, fellow alchemists, take care.